Yes, so how they started? They started after Ukrainian government changed its mind about signing the EU deal, which was scheduled for the end of November last year. The government and President Yanukovych had been telling people that they are very determined to sign the deal with the EU for 2 years at least, and it was very unexpected when several days before the signing ceremonies they said that Ukraine changed its mind and they are not willing to sign the agreement. So this was the trigger for the protests, and students started to protest, journalists, civil society activists, for Ukraine to reconsider its decision and to sign the agreement. But then, of course, after the beatings of the students happened on November 30th, then parents of those students came, and the protest became more about punishing those who were responsible for the beatings, for punishing the government. And then as the government kept using violence and repression against the movement, it backfired. And so the protest eventually became simply about bringing down the regime at the end, which happened. In comparison, in Ukraine, of course, as you can guess, people, they tend to compare those two revolutions. The Orange Revolution of 2004 and the Revolution of 2014. There is 10 years apart. They are 10 years apart, but they were, of course, very different in many aspects. One single aspect which is the same is that there was a phenomenon of Maidan created back in 2004, when people realized that they do have power and they can change politics in their country, they can change the course of where their country goes. That was one common thing. All the other things, they were different. Like first difference I would point at would be that Orange Revolution was more structured. There was much bigger participation of political parties in Orange Revolution. In Orange Revolution, it was a protest about changing, one political force with another political party. And so, of course, as the revolution was happening, political party that was representing Viktor Yushchenko, they were organizing people. They were teaching them some nonviolent tactics like bringing flowers to the police. They were appointing people, volunteers in the crowd who would make sure there is nonviolent discipline observed. And of course they were, distributing orange symbolics, and so it looked more like a concert, and no violence happened as a result of this structure and this organization. And we should not forget that that revolution happened after the rigged presidential election. So I myself, I was at that time working for Viktor Yushchenko team for his election campaign, and I know that, nobody expected that there would be a real revolution, but there was a big expectation that the election will be rigged, and that there was an expectation that people will come out. And I think initially the plan was that people will just come out and will have a great big protest, but then it will end. But because there was an expectation people would come out, the party people, politicians, some businesses in Ukraine, they were preparing for that. So they were printing those orange symbols and so on. This time, nothing like that at all. It was very ad hoc, very unexpected, very unstructured, disorganized. There was not a single person or power who would say, I'm in charge of this whole thing, I will make sure, I will take responsibility. Nobody took responsibility at the end. So it was led bottom up by people. And the second difference, which has to do with the first aspect, is that people were political during Orange Revolution because they were supporting Viktor Yushchenko. They were supporting this pro-European party. But this time people were not political. There are different polls, but some quote that 90% of people on Maidan did not support any political party at all. So it was less political, it was more civic movement. People were standing for human rights, for democracy, against dictatorship, for European values, against criminals and corruption in the government. That's why they didn't have any political leaders whom they would favor. And so finally, as I said, Orange Revolution had leaders, political leaders, like they were on the stage, people were kind of honoring them, people admired them. And this time, people did not admire any political leaders whatsoever. And it happened so that, okay, people had this uprising, and who is supposed to be on people's side? Of course, the political opposition. It's a natural way how things should develop. And political opposition, unfortunately, was very weak and unprepared for those events. So the three leaders of political opposition, Tyahnybok, Klitschko, and Yatsenyuk, they were on the stage, they were talking to people and so on, but they did not enjoy authority like among the protesters. And unfortunately, the violence at the end happened actually as a result, among other factors, as a result of the fact that there was no trust in opposition. There was no leadership on their part. And so when opposition negotiated these agreements with Yanukovych, and they kept negotiating, people did not really trust that opposition is interested in changing the system. They didn't really trust them. And that's why I would sum it up by saying that in 2014, this Euromaidan revolution, or we also call it Revolution of Dignity or European Revolution, there are many names. But this revolution was a more real one, because the civil society, people who participated, they were much more mature in terms of what they wanted. They wanted to change the system, and they didn't care about politicians because they have been betrayed before by the Orange Revolution leadership, and that's why they wanted a different thing now. So the fact that there was no leader, it was, on the one hand, it was a problem, because many people, they refused to mobilize because they said, well, there is no alternative to the president, to Yanukovych, so what are we protesting about? Nothing can be changed because there is no leader. What is your message? Are you protesting because you want a different leadership, you want a different president, but who's going to be this different president? There is nobody else. So definitely the message was not about the leadership. Instead, there were several messages, I would say, because this revolution was so bottom-up and kind of, unstructured. For some groups in this protest, the message was, let's fight the criminal system of police, of courts in Ukraine, because the abuse of human rights became just intolerable during Yanukovych times. And so many people came to protest to main square in Kiev and to main squares in their cities because they were victims of police violence, for example. Or they were victims of some kind of, their business were seized by some criminals who were backed by the government. So they were victims of lack of any rule of law in the country. So for them, it was kind of anti-criminal revolution. That was the message. For students, of course, the message was, we protest because we want to be in Europe, we want to study in Europe, we want to live like European youth. And that was the message for them. For other people, the message would be against corruption. It was a very strong message that we want a country which is free of corruption because the corruption is so endemic that it is really hard to tolerate. So, to answer your question, there was no coherent message at all, and it was not really communicated in some centralized ways, either through Twitter or other possible ways, but it just was, enough for a person. When you talk to those people on Maidan, very often they just heard in the media, on TV, that there is a protest in Kiev against the government, and they would join right away. They didn't even want to know what exactly people are standing for, because they had been waiting for this moment for years, because Viktor Yanukovych government created so many unhappy people, such great resistance within the society, that it was the matter of time when this revolution was to erupt. And EU integration just was this trigger. But people were ready without basically any messages, because they just wanted this government either to kind of stop doing what they were doing or just to leave. And that's why I think that was the motivation. At first, people had this memory of how Orange Revolution happened, that they came to the square, they had this happy concert, and then the president left. So they kind of instinctively, they tried to recreate this situation. They tried to repeat that. So they came in mass numbers, and sociologists, they say that actually this revolution was much bigger in terms of people's participation than Orange Revolution. So there were millions of people who came out. And they saw that the government does not react at all. Like they were protesting, like millions of people were in Kiev, in Main Street. And president said, like, I'm going to China, I have a trip. Like, he didn't even address the fact that there is this major protest in his country, which was, of course, very outrageous for those who protested. But they understood that, of course, he's not reacting. So there should be some change of tactics. And so they were just thinking what to do. But then the regime, and they were just staying on squares and keep coming to protests. The regime started to respond by arresting large groups of people, detaining them. They were called, like, political hostages, because then every time a portion of people was detained, then there were kind of negotiation with the government, and then those people were released and they were detained again back. And but what was worse is that the regime also started, people started to disappear. That was a really scary moment. Activists were beaten, they were kidnapped. In the center of Kiev, the police and criminals, titushki, they are called titushki. I know that in Iran you have basij, those civilians who were defending, helping the regime to defend itself during mass protests. But in Ukraine there was a huge army of some hooligans and also some explicitly criminal people who were released from prisons. And so those people would start kidnap activists, for example, in hospitals, because when during the protest they were beaten, people would go to hospital, and then those criminals, titushki, they were already waiting together with the police, waiting for activists in that hospitals, and then people would disappear from hospitals. And so it was a targeted repression. So given all that, more and more people in public space started to talk how to change the tactics, what to do. They started to say whether they should do the national strike, when national action, when all people would refuse to go to work, everything would be frozen, and then there will be too high cost, but that was a risky tactic, and nobody was able to organize something like that. Then another tactic emerged. People started to boycott products and services provided by the businesses that were affiliated with the ruling party. So they would print out leaflets, which brands you should not buy if you don't want to support Yanukovych regime. And that tactic was pretty good because some members of the regime, some deputies, they left the party because they were not able to maintain their businesses. Or some, for example, there was a boycott of bread that was sold in Kiev supermarkets, and that bread was produced by the ruling prime minister's firm. And so they started to repackage this bread into packaging that had no logos, for example, so that people keep buying it. But the fact that they started repackaging means that it really meant something. This protest was pretty effective, I think. Another tactic is that people, they started to seize government buildings and occupy them. It was effective, definitely, because what government was afraid of is that, that they will be paralyzed. For them, it's important to go to work every day to keep stealing people's money, and if they're not able to do that, of course, that was much more stressful for them than millions of people just standing and singing in the street. I would start with Automaidan. Automaidan, it's indeed a tactic. It's a group of people who had cars, so they were usually like mid-aged people, like young professionals, like middle class, who had cars in Kiev, other cities, and they were able to go and protest, not in the city, but outside. It was a very important task. Why? Because during the time of the protest, the president, he had his palace, as you know, 25 kilometers outside Kiev. And during the protests, he could just stay in his palace. It's a huge territory, and he would not even come to Kiev. So it looked like people were protesting and they were trying to storm his administration, but he wasn't even there. So people had a feeling like nobody is looking at us. We're here on our own, and he is like 25 kilometers away in the woods in his residency. And there was no way. People tried to organize marches there. But, it was freezing weather. It was like below 20 degrees Celsius, first of all. And you imagine walking 25 kilometers in a large group of people. It was impossible. So Euromaidan emerged because there was this need of having protest on the wheels. So they would go there to his residency, although it was encircled by so many law enforcement agents that it was impossible to come close. But still, they were trying to go there on many occasions and protest closer to where he is, where the heart of this regime, the President Yanukovych, is. They also went to other residences of other pillars of this regime, like his oligarchs, Minister of Interior, Prosecutor General, main people in the regime. So activists, some activists were going to protest there without the cars, but Automaidan was important because they were like, it was their specialization. They were going to all those, distantly located places where those politicians lived. And that's why. Very, very fast, they became very noticeable for the regime, and they became the target of prosecution more than any other group. And as you know, the activists, they were beaten, detained, and one was kidnapped, and then he was released eventually, but with his ear cut off. So they were effective, definitely. About Euromaidan SOS, it's a group. They work like in tiny room in Kiev, but their major it's an information tactic, a group that was created on social media, and it would help coordinate the movement in terms of what's happening on the ground. For example, always at night there was a threat that the police, special riot forces would come and just clean the Maidan by beating people, dragging them away. And so Euromaidan SOS, they were always reporting on what's going on. For example, our activist is on that square and he's afraid that they are coming. So you need to come right away from your apartments and join the movement, because otherwise it will be over. And so people would mobilize through Euromaidan SOS. Then another task of Euromaidan SOS was, of course, to report about injured people, about people who needed help, about different emergencies. Right now, Euromaidan SOS is, it was reporting, of course, about, dead people who were killed, helping to identify them, helping to find relatives. It was reporting about people who were missing, and there are still different numbers about who's missing. Either it's like 200 people or less, but there are a lot of people missing, and so Euromaidan SOS is involved in that. But other groups, apart from Euromaidan SOS, there was a group called Doctors of Euromaidan, or there was a group of cooks of Euromaidan, those who were preparing food. There was a group of civic sector of Euromaidan, which are activists who were professional activists working in NGOs, and they were trying to reimagine their activity in the context of Euromaidan. So there were many groups like that, but Euromaidan SOS definitely is a very good group and tactic, and now they created Crimea SOS. Same idea. They spread their urgent information online, and then Ukrainian media, websites, TV, they would just take information from them. So that's how they work. I think for people it is important to see that there is international support, that people in the world, some reputable people support them. So symbolically, I think it was important, but tactically it absolutely was not, because I remember this night when McCain came to Kiev, there was a concert and there was a very beautiful kind of show when all people had their lights. And then some activists, they were saying he's just distracted us, standing there like singing, doing this show for him instead of us just taking down the regime and just doing something which matters to Yanukovych. But of course, the fact that those celebrities and politicians from Europe, they were coming to Maidan, it created some feeling of protectedness. When people thought, of course, if we have senators on Maidan today, we will not be stormed. But the same guarantee would be when, there are a lot of people on Maidan, they wouldn't be stormed. But the fact that people knew that every day somebody plans to come to Maidan, it was kind of, more reassuring. But then at the end, it all evaporated because the regime became so violent that basically people understood that nobody cares about, which celebrity is present on Maidan at the moment. Well, this time, Ukrainian diaspora was really, really active and united in all over the world, because Euromaidan, it became a global movement, basically. yes, there are people in Ukraine on the ground who were there physically on Maidan, but then in every major city now in the world, you have its Euromaidan group activists who would go regularly to protest on the weekend and support Ukrainians, to protest in front of their governments, to protest in front of Ukrainian embassy, Russian embassy, whomever it may concern. Moreover, they were doing other important activities apart from those rallies. They were, first of all, collecting money to support protest in Ukraine. They were collecting money literally to buy some supplies for Maidan, to buy like hamlets for people to stay protected if they are beaten, to buy some food, to buy some medicine for injured people. So there were many grassroots initiatives in like Euromaidan San Francisco, Euromaidan New York, Euromaidan London was very big. The second important tactics, which I actually forgot to mention, that was done by diaspora. Very strong impact. They were, as you know, Ukrainian oligarchs, they have their residences, their companies outside Ukraine, in London, in Austria. And so diaspora Euromaidan activists, they would go and have a protest in front of the residency of the richest man of Ukraine, Rinat Akhmetov, who happened to be a supporter of Viktor Yanukovych. And so for Akhmetov, of course, there is reputational cost for if diaspora is doing something like that, because his neighbors and his business partners are looking at people who are protesting and covering themselves in blood and saying, you, Akhmetov, support the bloody regime and blood is on your hands. So, you know, business partner would think twice about whom he's dealing with if he was not aware about the nature of Ukrainian regime before. So they were doing that as well. They were also helping kind of to locate different family members of former regime, where they are. It's so interesting because, as you know, the regime became very pro-Russian and very anti-Western, but at the same time all their children were in the West and their wives were in the West, and they were hiding that. So diaspora, they physically helped to locate where they are. And the third and very important aspect is that they were helping information-wise, because diaspora, they knew foreign languages, German, French, English, so they were writing about Euromaidan, they were talking about it, they were helping to fight Russian propaganda, which already started back there, that was trying to discredit the image of Euromaidan by claiming some things, as you probably heard about, like there are fascists on Maidan, there are anti-Semites on Maidan, and so on. So diaspora was dealing with that as well in terms of information. And they were also writing petitions online a lot. Like they prepared this petition on With the People website, and petition, one petition after another, punish that person, help do this, help do that. And so it did create some attention. The White House sent official response that after your petition, the diaspora, we introduced sanctions. But they introduced sanctions because it was their own decision. But still, the fact that diaspora addressed their parliamentary representatives in their countries, here in the US they were addressed their congressmen, representatives, and they had meetings with them. I think it helped. Well, yeah, initially in Crimea, one has to understand first, to understand what kind of resistance we're talking about in Crimea, that Indeed, in Crimea, there is a large part of Russian population, and there is a large part of retirees, people who came even like from outside, from Russia, to spend their pension in Crimea. And so those people, they are absolutely always like pro-Russian, and they would welcome Russia annexing Crimea. But then young people in Crimea, people who grew up during Ukraine's independence. So this young generation, in many cases, they were against Russian occupation because they thought that Crimea is Ukraine, and for them it was unimaginable to think that now they are Russia. So they had those protests. When the occupation started, they were, young people would come and with Ukrainian flag, would say that Putin go home and things like that. And they would specifically state that they are Russians or they are Russian speakers and they don't need Putin's protection at all. But when this process progressed, when Crimea effectively became Russian, when Russia was first in total military control of Crimea, and then after the referendum, that was basically over. Because first of all, in Crimea, a significant number of protesters, of activists were kidnapped, and they were tortured. There are accounts that you can look up on the internet. They were also, one guy had also a piece of his ear cut, and his legs shoot, and some terrible things. And the first person, it still remains to be investigated, but the first person was a Crimean Tatar activist who immediately opposed the Russian occupation, and he went to protest. He also went to, because he said he wanted to enlist himself in army to protect against the Russians, and he disappeared. And then he was found dead in the forest. So that's why the environment was much more dangerous than it was in Kiev. Because Russian occupation happened not only by military forces of Russian Federation, but by criminal elements who were already in Crimea and who were, who received enormous powers during this event. They were able to kidnap whatever activists they wanted. They were able to do whatever they wanted. And many criminal elements came from outside Crimea. So it became just very dangerous. A woman who was just carrying Ukrainian flag, she wasn't even protesting. She said some guy came to her and he just took the flag fast and ran away. And then she came to him and to other group of people, and she said, "It's my private property. Don't take Ukrainian flag. I have right to carry it." And they just pushed her on the ground, like an older woman. So in such circumstances, and they were not police. They were just, people, criminals, hooligans, who had no regulations, no laws for them whatsoever. And that's why it's hard to talk about any activism when it became so dangerous for those who disagree with Russian occupation to speak up. Well, of course, ideally, as I see it, is that they should have moral responsibility to protect democracy, protect human rights. But if we are more realistic and we speak about how things are, I would say that first of all, this whole revolution that happened in Ukraine, it was very unexpected for Europe, for the United States. And Europeans, they were not ready to support Ukraine because Ukrainians were a little bit naive that they thought that they are protesting for European values. They were literally 100 people died under this EU flag because they were protesting for, European values and democracy and human rights and joining the EU and so on. It never happened before in history that anybody cared that much about the United Europe. But the United Europe, I think, disappointed those Ukrainians by not acting strongly regarding the, sanctioning Yanukovych regime. They were waiting till the last moment, and because they were benefiting European countries like Austria, like the UK, they are benefiting from financial inflows that are brought by corrupt elites from Ukraine, from Russia. And people in Ukraine, activists on Maidan, the mainstream opinion became that Europe has double standards. That Europe, of course, is talking about all those nice things, but then they don't stick to what they are preaching for. And so activists, they started to kind of demand from Europeans to introduce those sanctions, to punish the criminals, not let them into their countries. I think this is what should be done, because indeed Europe should appreciate this potential of young Ukrainian society, how much they are striving for this freedom and for those European values. Unfortunately, the United States and Europe, they are more focusing on the government. The government of Ukraine is indeed not as optimistic to look at as the society, because they are still people from old times. They are weak in terms of how they govern the country. They are still corrupt. And so Europe is simply looking at that and saying, you are still too corrupt and too difficult to deal with. We don't want you in Europe. While the US would say, you are too weak of a country, we don't need such an ally because there is nothing you can give us, and we cannot provide you with this security. And realistically, that's what's happening, despite the fact there is indeed Budapest Memorandum that you mentioned, which was signed in the 90s when Ukraine refused from the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, the UK, and the United States. But unfortunately, in that memorandum, there is an obligation of those guarantors to seek resolution and to seek help in case Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity is violated. But there is no clear obligation to militarily involve, like it is in Article 5 of NATO treaty. And that's why, of course, we see right now, Obama today was speaking about his support, and that he said that they already introduced pretty significant sanctions against Russia because of its invasion of Ukraine. And he said if Russia moves on, he will introduce even harder, more serious sanctions, which is good. But the Ukrainians, I think they had some illusions, some, people on Maidan that NATO, EU, and America will kind of defend them militarily if, in case, they are under the threat of invasion, which we see is not, of course, going to happen most likely. Yes, indeed, the revolution was leaderless, and which means that it doesn't mean there was no leaders at all. It means that if we compare like this whole movement with some ocean of lights, at certain periods, at certain moments, one light would flash brighter and became bigger, and so some leader would emerge. And then as the movement progresses, that leader would disappear and another person will take the leading role. And this is what really happened in Ukraine. For example, how the protest started. A blogger, a journalist, he blogged that he is going to protest because of Yanukovych's decision not to sign the EU deal. And at that point, he was the leader because he had probably the biggest followership on social media in Ukraine. And so people came. And then his leadership kind of subsided. Then during the moments when people were standing and standing and standing for 3 months and they had nothing to do, and they were there were a lot of moments in this revolution and people thought it's just, it's gonna be pointless. They will just go home and that's it, because the government is way too repressive, way too authoritarian, is not communicating with people. And at such moments, the leader was the singer, Ruslana. She was there on Maidan, mobilizing people, entertaining them, kind of, lifting up their spirits when they had no tactics. They were kind of waiting. They didn't know what to do. So she was the leader. And then eventually, and when there were discussions in the parliament, of course, the leader would be the parliamentary opposition, the leaders of deputies who were in opposition. So they played that role. So they were leaders. And then, of course, at the end, when the violence erupted, and when people had literally to fight, throwing Molotov cocktails and so on, the leader for a short time they became this right sector, the group, the right-wing paramilitary group, but they were not really, they were leader maybe for several days, because they kind of brought this new energy into the movement. And then eventually, to organize Maidan itself, it was organized into units called hundreds. So there were over 40 hundreds, people who physically were on Maidan all the time. So the leader was one MP, Andrei Parubi, who was the commandant of Maidan. So he was in charge of food supplies, organization, tents, self-defense units. So he was this leader, but he was more like a, tactical leader. He was not guiding people, telling them what to do, where to go, what the tactics should be. So everyone, as you can see, played their role, and it was like a horizontal network of people who had common goal. And it was a nationwide movement, because even people who were afraid to go to Maidan, they had support, their support for Maidan. They were just bringing money to Maidan, or they were boycotting products of the ruling party. And so one can say it's possible to make a revolution without any leaders. But then, of course, in the aftermath of the revolution, it becomes a problem, as you can imagine, because the old regime is gone, right? So you need to have a new leader for the country. And in Ukraine, the presidential election is going to happen on March 25th. And so several leaders who were on Maidan, they will run for presidency. But right now we have interim government, and I would say this government is for the most part controlled by Yulia Tymoshenko people. And as a result of Maidan, Yulia Tymoshenko a former Ukrainian prime minister who was imprisoned during Yanukovych times, she came out from prison and she says, now I will become a leader. And I will take care that all those things that you were fighting for on Maidan will be realized. But Maidan did not believe her, of course. And so right now, again, we see there is this tension between Maidan and current political leadership, because there is not enough trust. And I think the solution for such situation is that after the revolution happens and the old regime collapses, it's important to stay mobilized. It's important to demand exactly what you want from new leadership. Even if new leadership is not your ideal dream team of leaders, you need to use them as tools. And that's what activists are right now trying to do. Okay, nobody is fond of the new leaders who came because they are not new, they are like old people from old generation. But they right now have this pressure of Maidan, who are still staying there in smaller numbers, but still, because they are physically there, they can mobilize like within several hours. Many people can come there. It's physically important, like to be present there at the main square of Kiev. And activists, for example, they developed 4 packages of 4 laws that they want to be implemented right now, right away, like the law that would enforce transparent state procurement, the law that would enable public access to information, the law, anti-corruption law, and so they know what they want, and they just say if the parliament does not adopt this law, just people go and protest in front of the parliament. And so this civil resistance right now goes on. And I think this is actually happening because people learned their lessons from Orange Revolution. After Orange Revolution, this new leadership was elected and they all went home. And they thought, okay, now the new leadership will make us a democracy, prosperous country, and so on. And it turns out that the new leadership was as corrupt and as dishonest as the previous one, but less repressive. So right now they say, okay, we don't believe in leadership at all. And so we need to be leaders of our own life. And so every group has some interest, like small businesses, they are taking care about fair tax policy. Journalists care about public access to information, about creation of public TV. So they just go and lobby those projects, those causes they're interested in, and they are using the pressure of Maidan to make sure that the government listens to them. And unfortunately, this wonderful new experience is very much interrupted by Russian invasion, as you can imagine, because it is pretty stressful for people inside Ukraine when Russian troops are massing on the borders, and many voices are heard saying that you cannot go and protest in front of the parliament, criticize your government because you are in war with another country. And it's too dangerous because they may use this moment when the government is weak and criticized just to invade. You need to keep silent, you need to postpone reforms until the war is over. So there is a great dilemma right now I think for Maidan, for the movement, about what to do to protect against internal threat of their government kind of destroying the results of this revolution, or against external threat, Vladimir Putin regime taking over Ukraine. So they are deciding which threat is bigger for them at this moment.